will just introduce very briefly myself. But before I do that, I would like to thank the organizers. This is a fascinating conference going from interdisciplinary and throughout times and spaces. And it is fascinating for an anthropologist that has worked in the same area to see the recent historical work that is being done. So I am a director de recherche at the CNRS, so a full-time research fellow. I have been involved for many years in a European project about shared sacred spaces. I have in the Mediterranean, so around the North African coast, in Middle Eastern countries, actual Turkey, Anatolia, and the Balkans. I have published quite extensively on the subject, and my particular work is a combination of historical study of historical material, archives, and history works and field work, which was done in IIAC in Buyukada near Istanbul. I have co-edited with Dionigi Albera, who will be presiding the next panel, a collective book entitled Sharing Sacred Spaces in the Mediterranean back into 2012. And it has been translated into many languages, Spanish, French, of course, that was the original language, and Italian. So before I will just now present Mariette VERHOEVEN, who will be our first speaker, who is a research fellow at the Radboud Institute of Culture and History at the Netherlands, and at the Netherlands Institute of Turkey in Istanbul. She specializes in the field of early Christian and Byzantine architecture and focuses at the moment on the cultural history and transformation of Byzantine heritage in Istanbul. She has co-edited 3 books, and her latest article, published in 2010, is entitled From Justinian I to Mehmed II, Transformation and Continuity of Rituals and Liturgical Disposition in Hagia Sophia. So I invite her to start her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the organizers for inviting me. On the 5th hill of Istanbul's historic peninsula, in the neighborhood of Çarşamba, stands a building complex that is now known as the Fethiye Mosque and Museum, but that was built as the Pammakaristos Church. It is one of the some 30 former Byzantine churches and chapels which have survived in Istanbul in different conditions, forms, and functions. The Pammakaristos Church, which belonged to a monastery, was built in the 12th century by a certain John Komnenos. The best preserved part of the original church is a central space of what is now Fethiye Mosque, including the dome. At the end of the 13th century, the church and monastery of the Pammakaristos came into the possession of General Michael Dukas Glabas Tachenoiotos and his wife Maria. A north aisle was added to the northern wall of the original church, and the exterior south wall was decorated with a series of frescoes. Circa 1310, the Paraklesion, a memorial chapel for Glabas, was added on the south side of the church by order of Glabas' widow, who had become a nun. Later in the 14th century, an ambulatory that abutted the Paraklesion on the south side was added. These later additions, especially the Paraklesion, or South Chapel, in the form of a little church of the cross in square type, can be typified as late Byzantine or Paleologian. This is a view into the South Chapel that was built at the beginning of the 14th century. And this is a view of the exterior. The South Chapel shows inscribed and visual references to Michael Glabas and his wife. Here we see at the left a detail of a 23-line epitaph carved on the exterior of the Paraklesion. The poem eulogizes the general who took the monastic habit before his death. It also informs visitors that the South Chapel was built by Glebas' widow, now the nun Martha, to house his remains. Immediately below the eaves, there is a monogrammatic inscription here at the right, which reads, Michal Dukas, Glabas Tacheneiotos, protostrator and founder. In the interior, a metrical inscription surrounds the figure of Christ in the apse. It reads, on behalf of her husband, Michael Glabas, who was a champion and a worthy protostrator, Martha the nun has offered this pledge of salvation. The central dome of the South Chapel is decorated with a mosaic showing Christ Pantocrator surrounded by prophets. Written sources tell us that some 2 years after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the Pammakaristos Church and monastery became the see of the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, on the request of the patriarch Gennadios Skolarios, after he had temporarily been seated in the Holy Apostles' Church. The Pammakaristos Church was now a Christian place of worship in the capital of the Islamic Ottoman Empire, Istanbul. In the 1570s and 80s, several German visitors came to the Pammakaristos Church in the context of an attempted rapprochement between the Orthodox and Lutheran churches. Among them was Stefan Gerlach, who from 1573 to 1578 served as a chaplain to the imperial embassy and supplied information on the Orthodox Church. This illustration, showing the complex of the Pammakaristos Church in the 16th century, is from Gerlach's account. It was not until almost 150 years after the conquest of Constantinople, towards 1590, under Sultan Murad III, that the Pammakaristos Church was converted into a mosque named Fethiye, or Mosque of the Conquest, commemorating the conquest of Georgia and Azerbaijan. With the conversion into a mosque, the apse of the church was pulled down and replaced by an angular Qibla wall pointing toward Mecca. The interior partitions of the church were demolished to create a more open space, and the interior Christian decoration was removed. The South Chapel was transformed into a separate praying room with its own Qibla wall. When towards 1519 the church was converted into a mosque, the surroundings of the building had already become neighborhoods now mainly inhabited by Muslim Turks instead of Christians. Two great fires in 1640 and 1784 damaged the mosque. The base of the 18th century Baroque minaret was probably renewed in 1845 when the mosque was restored. After that, the mosque gradually dilapidated and eventually was abandoned. This photo, taken in 1937, shows that the mosque was in a bad state, with the stairs and a wooden structure, possible the dwelling of the imam, that were built at an unknown date against and over a part of the ambulatory. This situation fits with the general circumstances regarding Istanbul's monumental architecture in the early years of the Turkish Republic, when religious building dating back to Byzantine and Ottoman times had ceased to exist as functional spaces and sat empty in largely abandoned neighborhoods, as Alessandra Ricci formulated it. Over several long intervals between 1949 and 1963, the South Chapel of the former Pammakaristos Church was restored by the Byzantine Institute of America, now the Martin Oaks. The campaign included the removal of all additions dating from the Ottoman period, such as the Qibla wall and the layers of plaster that covered the mosaics on the walls. And the reconstruction of missing parts of the Byzantine building, such as 2 columns that were replaced by imitations in concrete. Around 1960, this part of the Fethiye complex became a museum under the jurisdiction of the Hagia Sophia museums. In 1961-62, the conservation of the mosaics was completed and the small apse, north and several windows were restored to their original form. A masonry wall was erected between the South Chapel and the main building. Here that means that wall is not there at the left. The latter, so the mosque part, subsequently became a functioning mosque again after a restoration that mainly consisted of the renewal of the plasterwork. And that was really necessary, as you see. The restoration of the South Chapel by the Byzantine Institute of America must be seen in the light of a change of attitude toward history and heritage that went back to the foundation of the secular Turkish Republic in 1923, when the Islam as a uniting force had to be replaced by a secular narrative of nationhood. The Committee for Research on Turkish History, which was established in 1930, formulated and propagated the so-called Turkish history thesis. The goal of the thesis was to prove that the Turks had a glorious past beyond the Ottoman past. The thesis posited that Central Asia, the homeland of the Turks, was the cradle of all human civilizations, and that therefore the Hittite, Greek, Roman, and Byzantine cultures within Anatolia were Turkish. The Ministry of Education, in a decree issued to every school in the mid-30s, stated it as follows, and I quote, "All historic works in Turkey attest to the creativity and culture of the Turkish race, even if they are referred to as Hittite, Phrygian, Lydian, Roman, Byzantine, or Ottoman. Denomination only designates periods. All are Turkish, and hence it is the duty of all Turks to preserve them." Unquote. Within that context, in June 1931, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk permitted the Byzantine Institute of America to uncover and restore the mosaics in Hagia Sophia. Other former Byzantine churches that subsequently were restored by the same institute include the Chora Church and the Church of the Pantocrator. Hagia Sophia and the Chora Church eventually became museums. The Pantocrator Church, or Molla Zeyrek Camii, remained in use as a mosque, but only at the Pammakaristos Fethiye complex was a combination created of a functioning mosque and a museum, the combination that exists to the present day. The Fethiye Mosque shows no signs of its former function as a church. The liturgical furniture includes a pulpit and a Qibla wall, indicating the direction of Mecca, with a prayer niche on the southeastern side. In fact, only the masonry and some fragments of sculptural decoration in the interior can be recognized and typified as Byzantine. The dimly lit interior, with squat masonry pillars and low arches supporting the walls, and light blue and white plasterwork in a very bad state, gives an impression of decay and neglect. Although the building has lost its function as a place of worship, the appearance of the former Paraklesion, now the Fethiye Museum, is that of a pristine Byzantine chapel. Here the Byzantine Institute had the power to preserve, or better to reconstruct, Byzantine history and to obliterate the Ottoman past. By turning the South Chapel of the Fethiye complex into a museum, it was deprived of its function as a place of worship, but the Christian religious meaning and connotation was restored. It stands now on its own property with an entrance gate as a Fremdkörper in its surroundings, the densely populated and conservative Islamic neighborhood of Çarşamba. The attitude toward Byzantine religious heritage changed once again in recent years. Under the AKP government, there is a strong focus on restoring Istanbul's Ottoman past. Not only Ottoman mosques, but also churches converted into mosques, such as the Pammakaristos Church and the Sergios and Bacchus Church, have been restored to their state in Ottoman times. And unfortunately, restoration reports have not been published. Instead of acknowledging the uniqueness of these buildings as visible witness of their past as Christian and Islamic places of worship, the current tendency seems to focus only on the latter. According to Robert Oosterhout, who worked on an earlier restoration of the Pammakaristos complex in 1997 and 2005, the building has been restored as a mosque rather than as a sum of its history. And Alessandra Ricci rightly remarked that there are, and I quote, difficulties in contemporary Istanbul of recognizing Byzantium, which continues to connote the ideological trusts and certain political agendas of conquest and conquered otherness, end quote. With regard to the monumental religious Byzantine heritage, this process of repudiation of the city's Byzantine past includes concrete acts of claiming and appropriation. The recent conversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, the intended conversion of the Chora Church, and the planned rebuild of the ruinous St. John Studios Church as a mosque also reflect this process. What does this mean for the Fethiye Mosque and Museum? Since 2018, the complex has been closed for restoration. The decision to restore the decayed mosque fits with the policy toward Ottoman religious heritage I described earlier. The restoration of the Fethiye Mosque complex is being carried out by a construction company on behalf of and under the responsibility of the Vakıflar of Istanbul. The last time I visited the building in July 2019, the interior of the building was completely stripped, meaning that all plaster and concrete layers had been removed, as well as the wall between the mosque and the museum. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to take pictures. It was very interesting, though, to see the open space with the Byzantine and Ottoman brickwork exposed. I was able to talk with the architect in charge of the restoration. She showed me around and explained what they had done and what they were planning to do. She also assured me that the whole restoration process would be documented. At that time, the plan was to reopen the building as it was, with its double function of mosque and museum. But given the recent developments in relation to Hagia Sophia and the dismantling of the Hagia Sophia museums as an organization, it is unclear what will happen. To conclude, I want to present some possible solutions for disclosing and presenting the multi-layered history of the site and making the significance of the place accessible to both tourists and the local community. Digital techniques now offer the possibility to unlock and to activate the memorial potential of contested religious buildings, such as the Pammakaristos Fethiye complex, in a historically relativistic, non-normative, and reversible manner. With the technique of augmented reality, 3D models, and other computer-generated input, information can be added to a live view of a heritage site, as you see here. In this way, information that would otherwise stay hidden can be overlaid on the real world. This technique offers great opportunities, not only for the visualization of the subsequent physical layers of a historical building, including decorations, inscriptions, and liturgical objects, but also for adding additional information taken from written, graphic, or photographic sources. An on-site experience in the form of an augmented reality application without devices would be set up in the form of a projection showing the different building and decoration phases. This technique has been applied in this Romanesque church in Catalonia, where the apse decoration was digitally recreated on the basis of photographs and studies, which are now in the museum in Barcelona. Another example is the temporary projection in the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome, a building with layers dating from antiquity until the 9th century. Fethiye Museum could be an ideal test case for applying digital techniques through which the multiple pasts of Istanbul's Byzantine Islamic religious site could be made visible without any structural intervention. The building is already a museum, and its small size would make investment in digital applications manageable. It's even imaginable that these techniques would also be applied at Fethiye Mosque outside prayer times. However, given the currency policy toward religious buildings with multiple paths, such solutions seems very far away. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I will immediately give the floor to Emma Loosely, whom I will very quickly present. So Professor Loosely is teaching at Exeter University in the Department of Theology and Religion, teaching Middle Eastern art and architecture in Manchester for a long time, and now specializes in Christianity of the Middle East and Caucasus. She focuses on material culture and early medieval Christianity in both Middle East and Caucasus. And her expertise today is on archaeology and architecture of early Syrian Christianity. During a grant in a research grant, she worked in Syria and spent very much time among a group of Urfali in Aleppo. And so rather than talking about architecture and archaeology, today we will have a fantastic, I think, talk about how today's population of displaced population remembers the mainland, the fatherland through one object, which is the Mandilion. And we are very lucky to hear you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So in the late 1990s, I moved to Aleppo to study the Aramaic dialect of Syriac, My aim was to read liturgical texts and also to gain some understanding of the Syriac liturgy by attending church services and seeing the rituals at first hand. In this way, I came to live amongst the Urfali in the district of Aleppo known as the Quarter of the Syrians, Hagia al-Syrian in Arabic. The Urfali are the descendants of the Christian inhabitants of Edessa, now known as Şanlıurfa, who were exiled in 1924 in the aftermath of the Treaty of Lausanne. At that time, there were still a number of elderly people alive who remembered the long march from Urfa to Aleppo. They talked of an arduous walk as young children that ended in a tented camp looking down over the ancient walled city of Aleppo. By the 1930s, the realization that they were never going to return had led to the construction of a church and more permanent housing. And by the end of the century, Hagia al-Syrian was a distinct city within a city. The overwhelming majority of the Urfali are Syriac Orthodox, but there are a smaller number of Syriac Catholics and Armenian Christians amongst the number. And at least up until the depredations of the current Syrian civil war, they remained together as one community. Before moving to Aleppo, I had been aware of the story of the Mandylion, the image of Christ said to have been miraculously imprinted onto a cloth simply by the act of Christ wiping his face on a towel. I knew that the relic was linked to Urfa, but it was unclear at that point how the artifact fit into the contested historical narratives of the city. From the outset, the Urfali were at pains to explain that they were unlike the rest of the Syriac Orthodox population in Aleppo, who had emigrated largely from Mardin and the Tur Abdin regions. They speak Syriac with a different accent, and they write with a distinctive handwriting style that is recognizably linked to this oldest Syriac subculture. And the older generation would often reminisce about the wonders of their lost city. These stories were being passed down to the younger generations, but as I now realize, they were becoming increasingly tangled as events and monuments were conflated as these stories were retold over time. Unsurprisingly, the fate of the Mandylion was often the subject of these stories, and I found it fascinating how many of the Urfali found it possible to accept several competing narratives about the fate of the cloth at the same time, despite this contradiction in believing of two fates for the same artifact. They appeared to have no difficulty in claiming that it was present both in the church of San Bartolomeo de Armini in Genoa in Italy, and at the same time it remaining hidden in Urfa. A further element to these tales was the fact that not only New Testament figures, but also Old Testament prophets were called upon to support the narrative, and they became part of the stories in a process that was appearing to confer extra legitimacy to these accounts. The stories around the Mandylion particularly came to prominence ahead of the visit of Pope John Paul II to Damascus in May 2001. Before his visit, he had presented the Syriac Orthodox Metropolitan of Aleppo, More Gregorius Johanna Ibrahim, with a facsimile of the Genoa icon. This was housed in a chamber, especially built to hold it just outside the west entrance to the church of Mar Georgios in Hagia al-Syrian, and a series of icons, including one of More Gregorios receiving the facsimile from the Pope in Rome, recounted the history of the Mandylion. Given the reverence awarded even to the facsimile, it came as something of a surprise to then hear of it to be presumed simultaneously present in a well in Urfa. This alternate narrative recounts that although Edessa was first conquered by the Muslims in 639, this was a very brief period, and it was not until the city was retaken by Muslims in the 12th century, after a Crusader occupation, that there was a more concerted campaign to appropriate Christian places of worship and convert them into mosques. According to the Urfali, during this upheaval, the Mandylion was taken and flung into a well. It is at this point that it becomes necessary to turn from the Urfali to the city itself in order to understand how multiple layers of beliefs featuring biblical and Islamic prophets have shaped the landscape in and around Urfa. Despite the events of the Old Testament being set many miles to the south in places such as Assyria and Canaan, for centuries the region has laid claims to links with Old Testament prophets and patriarchs. Haran, to the south of Urfa, has long purported to be the place where Abraham spent some years on his journey to Canaan, even if this does not make geographical sense if we accept that Abraham was traveling from his birthplace in Ur of the Chaldees. However, there is an Islamic tradition that Abraham was born in Urfa rather than Ur in Iraq. The holiest site of Islamic Urfa is the Belikligo, the sacred pool of Abraham, said to have been created when Nimrod tried to burn him in anger, and the pool miraculously appeared to save Abraham from the flames. This alternate narrative of the early life of Abraham, his birth in a cave, and his angering of Nimrod before he left for Haran, seems to be an Islamic tradition, but is also one that is accepted by many Oriental Christians who treat the sacred fish of the Belikligo with reverence. In the southern suburbs of Urfa, there is a tomb said to belong to the prophet Job in an Islamic cemetery and a mosque beside a small cave. The cave is believed to be the location of Job's suffering, and a well beside it is claimed to be a source of healing water, a subject to which we will return in a moment. Finally, to the southeast of Urfa is a village beside the remains of an impressive Roman or late antique town of mysterious origin. Nobody is sure of its name in antiquity, but a late antique chamber on the edge of the site is a shrine to the Islamic prophet Shuaib, who is said to be the biblical Jethro. And accordingly, the settlement is now known as Shuaib. Therefore, the city of Urfa and its environs have been overlaid with a layer of biblical significance that largely dates from the Islamic era, although some of these stories possibly had their origins in the Christian Edessa of late antiquity. It is this layering of religious narratives that has been used to give added significance to physical places of worship in Urfa. We have a great deal of textual information about the early Christian topography of Edessa, but practically nothing of this remains. The reason for this lies primarily with the river Daishan, which periodically swelled with flash floods, resulting in catastrophic damage and loss of life. In late antiquity, the Chronicle of Edessa records that these disasters occurred approximately once every century. They're recorded in November 201, May 303, March 413, and April 525. The waters would sweep down the lower ground to the west of the city, where the walls ran along the top of a rocky outcrop, before turning eastwards into the valley south of Edessa. This area bordered the royal gardens beneath the citadel and was a high-status district where the wealthiest and most influential residents lived, because it was in relatively close proximity to both the royal dwelling and to the source of the springs that were revered by the populace, and which later became the Belikligo. Some of this periodic destruction was averted after the 6th century CE, when, in the aftermath of the Great Flood of 525, Procopius reports that the Emperor Justinian ordered the building of a dam to the northwest of Edessa to divert the waters north and eastwards and thereby prevent future loss of life and property. Given that the city was taken by the Muslims just over a century later in 639, this means that Christian Edessa was taken just over 100 years after the rerouting of the Daishan mitigated some of the effects of periodic flooding. These two factors together mean that there would have been few, if any, Christian sites of great antiquity still extant in their original form. Despite this, we do know that many Christian places of worship in the city were allowed to function unhindered, and the native Syriac-speaking Christian population of Edessa retained a certain amount of religious autonomy as the community survived and even thrived. In 944 CE, the city was retaken by the Byzantines, which meant that once again churches could be renovated, expanded, or even built from scratch, as the Christians were no longer constrained by Islamic laws. It was not until 1078 that the city fell to the Seljuks, but only 20 years later it was again in Christian hands when some of the Crusaders on their way to the Holy Land split off to found the Crusader county of Edessa. When Edessa was defeated by Zangez's army in December 1144, it passed forever out of Christian rule, and its inhabitants were to live under Muslim overlords from then onwards. Naturally, thenceforward, the primarily Christian-dominated architecture and civic life of the city diminished as the Islamification of Urfa intensified. Given this tangled history and the regularity with which Edessa or Urfa passed between Christian and Muslim overlords throughout the Middle Ages, it is therefore no surprise that it is difficult to trace exactly which religious tradition was the source of each of the various legends about Old Testament figures. The fact that Ibrahim, Job, Ayub, and Jethro, Shuaib, are all significant in Islamic tradition, as well as in Jewish and Christian texts, adds to the feeling that the legends of Urfa have an element of syncretism to them that reflect this checkered history of Christian-Islamic interactions. One of these legends overlaps significantly with the narrative of the Mandylion that an informant amongst the Urfali told me. She said that it had the ability to cure skin diseases, and when the city fell to the Muslims, it was cast into a well. Ever afterwards, water from the well possessed miraculous curative properties, so that those who bathed in its water would be cured of skin diseases. She mentioned that the well was in a mosque that had been a church, but that had been seized and repurposed by the invaded Muslims. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but taking it slowly, it's possible to see how, rather like a dream weaves together memories, this story was based on a number of legends about Edessa. First of all, the curative powers of the Mandylion are central to the conversion narrative of the Urfali. They believe that King Abgar V, Ukama, Abgar the Black, wrote to Christ inviting him to join him as co-ruler of Urfa when he heard that Christ had the gift of healing. As Abgar had long suffered from a serious disease, and he believed that Christ had the power to heal him of his illness. The nature of the illness is still uncertain, but he is believed to have been a leper. And this would fit with the style of Abgar the Black if he had had the form of the disease known as black leprosy. In return, Christ sent the messenger Hananiah with the Mandylion, the cloth on which he wiped his face and which retained a miraculous imprint of his image, and a message. He said that Abgar should expect someone to come later in his name to teach the faith. Abgar is said to have been healed when he received the Mandylion, and he later welcomed Thaddeus or Adai, one of the 70 who converted the city. Following the king's lead, the entire city embraced Christianity, and the Urfali proudly claim that they are the descendants of the first Christian state in the world, as Edessa adopted Christianity as its official faith within weeks of the death and resurrection of Christ himself. Now, this Christian narrative of healing through a miraculous intervention is echoed in the beliefs around the complex where Job or Ayub is said to have suffered in the cave before he was cured. Interestingly, it has been posited that Job suffered with black leprosy before God delivered him. The well is believed to have appeared where Job stamped his foot, which is an Islamic addition to Job's story. And here we have two stories of miraculous healing, one brought about through the agency of Christ, and the other through the mercy of God or Allah himself. One gives us a miraculous artifact affecting this healing, while the other makes reference to a water source that possesses miraculous curative powers. However, on visiting Job's well in Urfa, it does not easily fit the topographical features present in the story of the lost Mandylion. The Urfali are adamant that the well in question belongs to a mosque that was formerly a church, and the narrative strongly suggests that this was an important, centrally located church, as the implication is that the Mandylion was not taken far. The act of throwing it into the well is presented as an impetuous event in the heat of the conquest. With these facts in mind, I set about investigating the location of this episode in the old city of Urfa. It was clear from my informants that this took place in a church not very far from the Pools of Abraham, and that it was a large and important foundation, not a small chapel serving a poor or small congregation. It quickly became apparent that only one site appeared to have all these elements for it to be the Church of the Lost Mandilion, and indeed I then found an official Turkish language guide that made this same connection. And here we have the view of the Ulu Jami from the Urfa citadel. We have many tales of Byzantine-era churches being adapted into mosques after the Crusades, and the reasons for this vary. But the most common one is simply the desire of the conquerors to stamp their authority on the subjugated populace and to understand that underline that their God, in this case Allah, is greater than the God of the vanquished. With regard to the Crusades, we find two complementary impulses in relation to the conversion of churches into mosques. First of all, new churches built by the Crusaders were swiftly converted into mosques, not least because they did not have deep-rooted local congregations in the same way that pre-Crusading churches had their native communities. Secondly, we have several accounts of cathedrals, or the largest and most important churches in a town or city, being appropriated and converted as a form of punishment for the perceived collaboration of the local Christian community with the Crusaders. This is always given as the reason why the Madrasa al-Halawiya was built on the site of the Byzantine Cathedral of St. Helena in Aleppo, and is also believed to be why elements of the Church of St. Stepanos in Urfa were incorporated into the Ulu Jami in the 1170s. Guidetti's article, The Byzantine Heritage in the Dar al-Islam, Churches and Mosques in Al-Ruha between the 6th and 12th centuries, discusses the process of how early Islamic architecture built on a Byzantine inheritance, and also how sites such as the Ulu Jami incorporated Byzantine architectural forms and spolia into their fabric for both aesthetic and pragmatic reasons. Any visitor to the mosque today can see that it was built on or near a church. The courtyard reveals both Byzantine elements reused in a new context and the adaptation of earlier buildings to Islamic usage. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is the hexagonal minaret, which can be compared to some extent with the famous and sadly now destroyed minaret of the Great Mosque of Aleppo. The door to the minaret is clearly reused from a Byzantine building, and the plain, well-dressed masonry follows a direct line from the late antique villages of the Syrian limestone massif in the south via sites such as Shwaib northwards towards Urfa. The minaret derives not only from medieval Islamic examples, but also from the church towers that dotted the region in late antiquity, as its simplicity means that it lies midway on a scale between such monuments as the towered facade of the 5th century church at Kalblose in Syria and that of the famous Aleppo minaret. Interestingly, the process by which the Church of St. Stepanos was converted for Muslim usage is akin to that of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, rather than the nearer, in both chronology and geography, example of Aleppo. In Aleppo, the apse of the Cathedral of St. Helena was retained as the prayer hall of the Madrasa al-Halawiya, and the rest of the church disappeared under the adjoining mosque complex. In the case of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, it has been widely argued that the earlier church was built in the middle of the enclosure of the temple that originally stood on the site. The Semitic shrine to the god Hadad was Romanized and appropriated as a temple to Jupiter Dolichaeus before the Christians in turn confiscated the site and built the church of St. John the Baptist. Therefore, although the church was razed when it was sold to Al-Walid for redevelopment as a mosque, elements of the building were retained and incorporated as spolia in the complex, with the external wall of the temple enclosure becoming the external wall of the mosque and its courtyard. This appears to have been the pattern followed by the builders of the Ulu Jami, as the repurposed Byzantine doorway and the capitals dotted around the mosque courtyard have been noted above. But another distinctive feature noted by Guidetti is that the wall on the north side of the courtyard has been created from the Byzantine church that once stood on this site. One of the arches has been knocked through to provide a northern entrance to the mosque, but it is still recognizably a feature of the earlier church, despite the alterations made to incorporate it into the fabric of the courtyard. Therefore, it is clear that the Zangid conquerors of Edessa wanted to erase the Christian heritage of the city in a way that was more comprehensive than the process used with the Byzantine Cathedral of Aleppo. Whether or not this was because Aleppo never fell to the Crusaders and therefore emotions were not as passionate, we do not know, but it is clear that the church was systematically erased. On the other hand, the new overlords of Al-Ruha, as they renamed Edessa, were pragmatic enough to reuse many elements of the earlier building rather than waste good construction materials. As Guidetti points out, such salvaged material would not have been kept entirely for the new mosque, but also for a variety of other projects, such as repairs to the city walls and new work on the citadel. What this information means is that there is a clear architectural basis to the stories of the Urfali about how one of their most significant churches was appropriated and altered for use as a mosque. Additionally, on entering the prayer hall of the Ulu Jami, the visitor is aware that there is a well inside the hall to the east of the main entrance. Whereas it is commonplace to have wells and water basins in mosque courtyards for ablutions and other uses, it is less common for a well to be placed inside the prayer hall itself. It is this well that is said in local tradition to be the one which the Mandylion was cast into, and for that reason it is believed to have curative powers. Therefore, we have come full circle, as the story told to me by the Urfali in Aleppo accords with the beliefs of the Muslim population of Urfa. This is in direct contrast to the Eastern Orthodox Christian belief that the Mandylion was taken to Constantinople by the Byzantines for safekeeping, but, as mentioned above, leads to the curious situation that many descendants of the Christian Urfali believe in a dual fate for the relic, where it somehow remains in the well in the Ulu Jami, whilst also being present as an icon in Genoa. What this story tells us is that there are two strands to the study of places with a continuous tradition of worship. The first concerns the archaeology and architecture of these sites and the study of the physical traces left behind. There hasn't been room to expand further in this paper, but the site of the Ulu Jami was a synagogue before it became the Church of Saint Stepanos, and it would not be surprising if it transpired that it had a religious function even before it was used by the local Jewish population. This leads us to the second point, which is that once a location becomes imbued with a sacred aura in the minds of the local populace, then it begins to accrue an extra patina of holiness as various beliefs about events taking place at the site enter local consciousness. They're then repeated and embroidered. The story of the Ulu Jami and the Mandylion presents an especially interesting case, as here we find an exiled population recounting a story essentially the same as that still circulating in Urfa 100 years after their expulsion from the city. It is to be hoped that in the future, it's possible for the sacred topography of Urfa to be mapped in order that the complex relationship between the three Abrahamic faiths in the city can finally be fully understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Loosely, for this interesting paper about how myths and legends travel, and not only objects of veneration. We will, as we are running a little late, I will introduce our last speaker, Professor Paschalis Androudis from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, teaching in the Byzantine, in the Department of History of Archaeology, and teaching Byzantine art and archaeology in this department. He has many trades. He's a man of many trades, as he is both an architect and historian and a conservation specialist, with a degree in architecture, in Byzantine art and archaeology, and a PhD in Byzantine archaeology from Paris Sorbonne. his research covers both history and conservation. So today he will speak to us about a specific site, the Church of Agios Amphilochios in Konya, and its transformation to the Eflatun Mescidi. Thank you very much. Your floor is yours, Paschalis Androudis.
Thank you very much. Mrs. COUROUCLI, for introducing me.
Professor COUROUCLI?
No, if you can hear me, please.
Yes.
First, I would like to. I have not a stable connection of internet. Excuse me for this inconvenience. Ευχαριστώ πολύ που με παρουσιάσατε, κύριε COUROUCLI. Thank you very much for introducing me, Mrs. COUROUCLI, of this conference, for inviting me, especially the Obaldia, to this great conference. Now lost Byzantine Church of Hagia Sophia in present-day Konya was built on the artificial hill of the ancient acropolis of the city, known as Aladdin Pesi, that means Aladdin's Hill. Sultan of Rum, Aladdin Kaykobat I, ruled 1219 to 1237. Sultan, probably the most eminent of the Rum Seljuk dynasty, renovated the mosque and the kiosk of Kilit Arslan II, which was built around 1173-1174. We can see some old photographs of this kiosk and Minite tiles, vestment of the history of this kiosk, as well plaster decorations of its interior, as well the mosque on the hill, which took his plan of this mosque, intention of Sultan Aladdin Kaykobat I, and some other photographs of the exterior and interior of this mosque. Saint Amphilochios was the patron of the city of Iconium and gained much popularity through Byzantine times. He was a Christian bishop of the 4th century, born in Cappadocia, probably A40. He was probably a first cousin of Gregorios of Nazianzos, and he died probably in 394, 403. Of an aristocratic descent, he was brought up in a religious atmosphere in his family. He studied law in Antioch with Libanios, and he practiced his profession in Constantinople, but he retired very soon and came back to his native homeland, Cappadocia, in order to lead a religious life in the vicinity of his friend and relative Gregorios, the so-called theologian of Nazianzos. He joined Basil of Caesarea in his philanthropic activity, and in 374 he was placed, probably by Basil, bishop of an important city of Iconium. After the death of Basil in 374, he maintained his close relation with Gregory the theologian, and he accompanied him to the Council of Constantinople, 381. In the history of theology,
Doktor Androudis, çok özür dilerim.
occupies a place of prominence.
Doktor Androudis.
Dr. Androudis, can you hear us?
Messalians included and ecclesiastical sources described him with flattering terms. It is noteworthy that he is quoted by councils as late as 787. Amphilochios started to study theology only after he became a bishop, and by this fact, his work is quite simple. As George Florovsky noted, his theological works prove that he had no philosophical background or particular interest in it, and also that his writing was inspired by a calm and sincere faith, and his homiletic use of rhetoric, describing it as reminiscent of Gregory the theologian. Saint Amphilochios, venerated by the Orthodox Church on November 23, has gained, through his rich activity and his work, most of which has been lost, not only a place in historiography of a wise man. The latter nation and his rumors spread in the next centuries are very useful regarding its search in Iconium and the adventures of it after the Seljuk conquest of the city by the end of 11th century. Now we proceed to the presentation of the church. The church of Hagios Amphilochios, built on the Roman artificial hill that we'll discuss, was dedicated. The church of Hagios Amphilochios of Iconium is not certain whether the church in the old photographs is not a typical one of an old Christian church, but of a church that can be ascribed by its typological and morphological features, like these features and the dome, the form of the dome, to the Middle Byzantine period, especially to 10th, first half of 11th century. The same phenomenon could be observed with other Byzantine churches in Anatolia dedicated to saints that lived in the early Christian period, and we can refer to the now ruined church of St. Clement in Ankara, and the church of St. Gregorius the Theologian in Karvali, Gelveri in Cappadocia that we presented 10 years ago in the International of Sofia. We can assume that they were churches dedicated to these saints built in early Byzantine times, but they were renovated or rebuilt in the Middle Byzantine era. There is also written evidence for the existence of a church of St. Thecla in Iconium, but we ignore its fate. The presence of many window mullions of early Christian churches of Iconium as Polia in the wall of the courtyard and the interior of Aladdin Camii in Konya probably lead us to the reuse of this material, which probably originated from these ruined churches of the city. But how this Byzantine church of Hagios Amphilochios became Eflatun Meskidi, that means Platos Mesquite in later times, as we will see, it is a very interesting reason. The church of Hagios Amphilochios, or Eflatun Meskidi, is known from old engravings and photographs. These are some old engraving of the middle of 19th century, above to the left, and some old photographs of this church, as well as its grand plan, the only one that we have, which was published by the eminent archaeologists William Ramsay and Gertrude Bell. Unfortunately, the church, with later alterations, is no longer extant. It was demolished in 1921 during the Greek-Turkish War. The church and the nearby Aladdin Camii formed once part of the Seljuk Palace, established on the citadel of the city, from which only a ruin of the kiosk of Kilich Arslan II survives. According to the plan that was published by Ramsay and Bell, the church was a crossed-in square dome church, external dimensions 1320 and 1580 meters, And this grand plan was very irregular and not a typical one of this type of church, because there was this area as well as its eastern part of the cross. Moreover, there were many blocked openings. Here you can see in the plan the place of the mihrab that was created there after of the church to a small mosque. And finally, a big wooden clock tower, Saat Kulasi, was added in later times to the top of its dome. It is obvious that the initial church suffered serious alterations through time, not only externally, but also in its ground plan. We'll try to trace the chronicle of these alterations. Thus, again, this plan and apart this plan, and in order to determine the building history of this church and its alterations, the only documentation could be provided by the old photographs of the end of 19th and the beginning of 20th century, and their careful examination. These flashes, red flashes, arrows, can see some remarks that we can make to some parts of the church. The first scholar that made comments on these photographs and wrote an article on the church was the late Turkish professor Semavi AJ in the late 1950s. AJ made important remarks, but did not give a satisfactory explanation for the irregularity of the plan of the church. Late reference to the church by Scott Redford was limited to the use of the church as a palace church by the Christian wives of the Seljuk Sultan, associates or servants. And of Alania were probably kept by the sultans for reasons, as well as other Christian associates and servants of the Seljuk court. As for the church of Hagia Sophia, Tekinalp made an hypothetical restoration of its interior, but re-examined. As we can
Merhabalar tekrardan. Dr. Androdis.
Hello again. I guess we had a problem with Dr. Androidis' connection, but now he's back. Ben,
can you see it, please? Yes. Okay, thank you. We built with arches. Southeast corner of the house, east wall. The northeast corner did not have an outer apse. On the south arm of the cross was a two-lobed blocked window inscribed within a recessed arch made of bricks. This window did not conserve its mullion. We also observe in this, as well as in various parts and especially in the east wall, where the big semicircular apse was, alterations made with big stone blocks and windows typical of later periods, especially from the Ottoman period. These alterations. And in the northern part of the church, we see also in the eastern part of the church, and some blocked opening and we tried chronological this together with the vestige of in the south of the church, this part of the wall of the church led us to a different hypothesis on the initial plan, and it's on the basis of our remarks we trace the hypothetical scheme of the different periods observed in the masonries of the church. And we strongly believe that the original plan of the Middle Byzantine Church was a typical one with clearly inscribed cross and the narthex. We have no evidence that the transformation of the church to a small mosque without minaret, a flatoon mesquite, that means the mesquite, took place in the time of the reign of the Seljuk Rum dynasty. We are not certain whether the oriental part of the church and its narthex were demolished during this period and the church became smaller in size. In any case, the existence of a church with icons, priests, and Christian attendants in the citadel of Konya, where the Seljuk was built, take into account the Christian males of the Sultan and sultans and their associates and servants. And we have depictions of women, Seljuk women, and some researchers believe that some of them were probably Christian, had Christian Alp already noted. Would have been practiced. Possessed the sort of Christian religious and cultural infrastructure which made them functioning and continuation of a Christian inner life possible. Tekinalp also tried to attribute the presence of these churches in the census terms of tolerance or necessity. In the end, he noted that both these senses could explain the existence of churches within a Seljuk palatial context. The same phenomenon was also traced with many examples by Rustam Shukurov, who also showed that many Seljuk sultans were baptized Christians, probably in these churches, and some of them were proud of what he called the double identity, which could use according to their interests. Thus, Seljuk Sultan to Christians abroad present themselves as Christians, but to their people and Muslim rulers, they were always faithful Muslims. It seems, however, that at least one of these sultans kept his Christian or crypto-Christian faith and fled after the turbulent period that succeeded the Seljuk defeat at Köse Dag in 1243. Izzeddin Kaikavus II fled with his supporters. Rustam Shukurov estimates them about 40,000 people to Byzantium and then to Dobruja, where Gagauz people of Turkish language and Christian faith were established. It seems, however, and as far as I know, by this, like the Karamanlis live in Cappadocia. They were Christians in faith and Turkish in language. Tekinalp shows that the church was repaired. We can see a picture of the church and the ground plan of the church. And as we can see in the ground plan, it's a triconch church. The initial phase of the church is triconch, and there is an outer wall, probably in the Seljuk period. And some other photographs of the church, the south side of the church, the north part of the church, and the western entrance, and part of the dome, which is still 12th, 13th century. This church was repaired or even built at the time when Aladdin Kaikobad I was constructing his palace. In the castle, there are other churches which were never converted to mosques or to small mosques. The interior of the Church of Alanya has no signs of a mihrab, but conserves traces of its Byzantine frescoes. You can see in this place of a saint, showing that it was never converted into a mosque. With regard to the Eflatun Mesgidi in Konya, Tekin Alp argues that the church in Konya was converted into a small mosque at a much later date, somewhere between 1466 and 1476. In addition to these churches, Scott Redford suggested that the castle churches might be dated no earlier than the 13th century, were likewise built to accommodate the local Muslim rulers' predominantly Christian harem. And again, these pictures, it is possible that the situation in the early Ottoman imperial harem until the second half of the 14th century, indeed from 1290 the first, 1380 while one was even encouraged the local Christian to return to the former faith, thus manifesting her Christian identity. Returning to our church in Konya, it seems that its transformation to a small mosque did not take place in Seljuk times, but probably in Karamanid period, or after the Ottoman annexation of Konya, possibly between 1466 and 1476, as Majid Tekinalp supported some years ago. The hypothesis of the Turkish scholar seems plausible, but on the other hand, we have a long gap of time from the early 14th century to 1466, or at least, in which the church passed from Christians. No rich evidence for the strong presence of Christian wives of Turkoman Karamanid in their court. This a bigger Byzantine church became a square and cubic structure crowned by a dome, which is not far from the main architectural concept of mesgids. As for the unusual Turkish name of the church, Eflatun Mesgidi, that means small mosque of Plato, this is certainly a Turkish Christian wise bishop, Amphilochios, to the famous ancient Greek philosopher. In fact, Plato was never present in of Ionian, and also bear in mind that there are other ancient sacred places in the vicinity of Konya, which were attributed to the Hittite sacred place with springs, which was named Eflatur Pinar. And present-day photographs, Manastir, old photograph, and present-day photographs. As William Hasluck in the early 20th century, this curious syncretism with cultures, religious, and finally thrown to all of us as Mevlana and his disciples in his lodge when Konya was a great multi-ethnic city open in different influences. We know, for instance, the special relationship of Mevlana with the monks of St. Hariton, Eflatun Manastiri, Ak Manastir. Thus, we the transformation of Agios Amphilochios to MS after the end of the reign of Seljuks in Konya. That means in the period of Karamanids, when there was not probably a need for a church within the palace on the top of the hill of the citadel, And to comment, we can probably examine the architectural history of Agios Amfilochios if we compare this church to another Byzantine church in the vicinity of Konya, in Sile. It's Hagia Eleni in Sile, a church, Middle Byzantine church, period of contemporary church with Agios Amfilochios that it was restored by the Turkish state and now it's a museum. Thank you very much. The secretaries.
Thank you, Professor Androudis, for this interesting talk. We have unfortunately missed some of your sentences, but I'm sure that we can discuss points in your presentation. Now, if you agree, we'll briefly comment on 3 papers. And hopefully by that time we will have some more questions. I only have one here, so I will take each paper one by one and say 1 or 2 comments and questions so we can open the discussion. The first paper about of Mariette VERHOEVEN, I think is very interesting about how the politics of World Heritage are being negotiated today between the history of a foreign scientific organization, the Byzantine Institute of America, Dumbarton Oaks, secular authorities at the beginning of last century in Turkey, and actual or potential local worshippers of these spaces. These are the dynamics of World Heritage in a way, in a very, very small nutshell here. So my question will be that in these times of post-Kemalist nationalism and religious revival, questions of this kind of World Heritage seem to be negotiated within a bundle of what I would call a post-cosmopolitan conditions and terms. And your digital proposal is symbolically, I find, very powerful into getting out of this impasse. But it poses different options about possible multiple audiences. And this is fantastically interesting for an anthropologist, because that means that you have a sort of web of legends, of alternative legendary that can start from a specific location and go out into making more connections. So will that lead to different versions of history, or how do you envisage this powerful tool? This is one question. And I have a question for Professor Loosely about your inner, I find your idea fantastic about this parallel between what happened to monuments and what happened to populations, right? And how these re-establishments and displacements travel. So I would, your analysis is mixing historical, archaeological, and legendary, today's legendary tradition of the Mandylion is around finally the question of how one claims heritage about origins, heritage about who is the heir of this or that tradition. And this is, Mandylion, if you look into Eastern, Greek-speaking Eastern Christians, you also have icons in Mount Athos and all that. So it is fantastic. It is, I find it was fantastic the way you made the parallel between today's beliefs and these legends and objects that travel from place to place. So my question is about how would you go forward about establishing the parallel between displaced populations and their political, religious ideas about themselves, how they represent themselves, and these archaeological monuments. That's my question to you. And for Androuvis, I would comment, actually, not ask a question, because you mentioned at the end of your talk Haslak and his work at the beginning of the century from the British School at Athens. He walked around the Balkans very much. He was very, very active in the northeastern Greek, Bulgaria, and Turkish border. And he insisted on the reversibility of these converted spaces, that these were related to a succession of occupations, right? Successive occupations. So one army would come and the place would be officially something else, while still continuing to attract the same local population. And this is what brings us, I think, to the reality of conversion and or sharing situations. And I think these are two kinds of questions. First relates to the longue durée. It's good to remember that the conditions of religious practices in Ottoman and post-Ottoman lands are complex and shifting, so they're never very stable. They can change over time. And the second series of questions is about local knowledge, about how knowing and asking questions about who worships which Holy Spirit, where, when, with whom, and following what ritual grammar. This opens a very larger question of the multiple levels of sharing of non-exclusive religious practices. This is anathema to official religion, but there you are. And the legends associated with sacred spaces that have changed hands sometimes more than once over time in the longue durée. So if you want to react to that, I can just mention one more question, which is addressed to Professor Luzuli. Is there a connection between the belief mythology of Urfa and the epigenetic culture of the settlement, which is now called Gürcü-Tepe, located in Göbekli-Tepe and its vicinity? And then this question, if so, from Joseph Nasse. So who wants to start?
I'm happy to start.
Okay.
The question about Göbekli Tepe, if I understood, is that right? Yeah. I'm actually married to a prehistorian, so I visited Göbekli Tepe because he wanted to see it. I know I have friends in Syria, a Jesuit priest who's a good friend, who would argue that there are certain places that seem to have a kind of, I don't know, an intrinsic sacred aura that attracts different religions to them. And you tend to have, as time goes on, you get different layers. It's clear that something around Urfa attracted people in prehistory, because we have Göbekli Tepe. We also have places like Sumata, where we have ancient Aramaic inscriptions and high places. This region has was the center for a variety of different cults, and over time these were then overlaid by the Abrahamic faiths, in particular Christianity and Islam. The problem is, and this I think relates to your question about displaced people, you have to have access to different regions to do your research, to see if you can fit the monuments and the physical remains with the oral histories, with the sort of beliefs that people carry with them as populations, whether in place or whether displaced. And as I'm sure many people on this platform know better than me, it is quite a difficult region to work in. It's had a lot of problems. It's had problems with internal unrest in the past. Since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, it's been a difficult region to access because of border problems. So over time, for large swathes of the sort of 20th century and now into the 21st century, there have only been very definite small windows when field work has been really practical. And it hasn't also been terribly easy for many teams to get permission to do archaeological work. And I think this feeds into your question, really, that a lot of these populations that are displaced, like the Urfali, there were good reasons for why they were displaced in the first place. It's often not possible for them to go back. And even if it does become possible in political terms, if a war ends or so on, then there becomes psychological reasons why they can't go back. When I was living amongst the Urfali, this was a time at the sort of turn of the 20th and 21st centuries when there was really no reason why they couldn't go back to Urfa. It wasn't far across the border from Syria into Turkey, and there was no reason why a Syrian citizen couldn't get a visa and visit Turkey. But a lot of them had a psychological reasoning that they were not prepared to go back to Urfa until it was their city again, and that it was acknowledged that they were one of the true Urfali, and they were arguing that the current inhabitants were incomers in some way that they weren't. So I think, you know, there are these interlinked questions of whether politically you're able, whether there are external factors, whether there's been a natural disaster like an earthquake, or it's some factor like a civil war, or then we move on to these psychological barriers that these displaced communities put in place, where maybe it's self-protection, that they mentally impose various barriers and various conditions before they're prepared to set foot in the homeland, because it's so idealized. I think they have a kind of fear that if they do go back, they'll be disappointed in some way. And I don't know whether that answers the question, but I think that's probably the clearest I could put it.
Right, thank you very much, thank you. I think we have to move on because we're very little time left. So maybe one of the other, you want to, yes, Mariette VERHOEVEN, yes.
Yeah, it's just short, I think. So your question was about these like multiple histories and how you engage with them. And I see these technical digital solutions as a means to not have to decide on whose heritage or whose memories you, because if you intervene in a building, if you restore a building, you always have to make choices. And the Byzantine Institute of America did it probably with at that time good reasons, but they also obliterated a serious part of the history of the building, namely the Ottoman past. So now we can use these digital techniques to not have to make that decisions, and then to show these multiple histories and multiple memories. And I'm not an anthropologist, but I would love to engage also with the people in this conservative neighborhood about, do they really realize what this Fethiye museum is and was? I don't think so, namely, and hopefully it will be reopened as a museum, but I couldn't find a solution. I presented the digital solution to the architect in charge, and he is very much open to it, but not the Vakkervlag, I'm afraid. So she said, we want to reopen it, the complete building as a museum, but she said that's not an option at all. So in the best, it will be a museum again, because it's a separate part of the building, but I really don't know. And all my contacts in Istanbul, architects, and no one knows at the moment so how this restoration will end, when it will end, and what will be done. So that worries me a little bit.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that was I mean, I was begging for this kind of answer. And there's one more question to Mr. Androudis from the same auditor, if I say participant. Could it be used as a sun temple before it was built as a church? And that it was built on such a hill and a clock was added later, and as an observatory. So if you want to answer both questions, Professor Androudis, it would be nice. Thank you.
You asked me whether it was used as a sun temple, if I understood.
This is from Joseph Nassé, right?
I don't know whether it was used as a sun temple. It was a church, and then it was transformed to a small mosque. I don't see any condition. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, and, I just read the question that was given to me. I cannot say more about it.
And the notion of Saat Kulesi, the clock tower, that means that it's in the central part of the city. That means it's close to the most important part of the city. That's Saat Kulesi. You can find in Greece many central positions, central parts of the towns, the cities. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think we arrived at the end of the panel. Almost on time. So it's for me to thank you very much for your fascinating presentations, and to leave you to the lunch break. And I give the floor to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.